Hi everybody, thanks for joining me again. We are picking up with Pinocchio, so I hope everybody's comfortable. I hope everybody has their beverage, and let's get started. We're on chapter 32. Pinocchio gets donkey's ears and then becomes a real donkey and starts to bray. And what was this surprise? I shall tell you, my dear readers. The surprise was that Pinocchio, when he woke up, scratched his head, and while he was doing so, he noticed... Can you make any guess as to what he noticed? He noticed, to his great amazement, that his ears had grown several inches. You must know that puppets from their birth have very small ears. In fact, so small that they are invisible to the naked eye. So you can imagine how surprised he was when he noticed that his ears had grown so long during the night that they looked like two brooms. He hurried to find a mirror that he might see himself, but he could not find one. So he filled his wash basin with water, looked into it, and saw what he had been hoping never to see. He saw himself decorated with a magnificent pair of donkey's ears. Can you imagine poor Pinocchio's sorrow, shame, and despair? He began to cry and scream and beat his head against the wall. But the more he cried, the longer his ears grew, and they became hairy at the top. A charming little squirrel that lived on the floor above him, hearing his loud cries, came down to see what the matter was, and seeing the puppet in such a state, he asked earnestly, "What's happened to you, my dear neighbor?" "I am sick, dear squirrel. I am very sick, and of such an awful disease. Do you know how to count a pulse?" "Yes, I think so." "Then will you please see if I have a fever?" The squirrel put her right forepaw on Pinocchio's pulse, and then said with a sigh, "My friend, I'm very sorry, but I have bad news for you." "What is it?" "You have a very dangerous fever." "What kind of fever is it?" "Donkey fever." "I've never heard of such a thing," said the puppet, though he knew well what she meant. "Then I shall explain it to you," answered the squirrel, "for you must know that in a few hours you will no longer be a puppet or a boy." "What will I be?" "In a few hours you will be a real donkey, like those that draw carts or carry cabbages and vegetables to the market." "Oh, poor me," cried Pinocchio, seizing his ears with his hands and pulling and jerking them as if they might belong to somebody else. "My dear lad," said the squirrel, wishing to console him, "you can't do anything. It is your destiny, for it is written in the decrees above that lazy children who dislike books, schools, and masters, and who spend their time with toys, games, and amusements, must end up, sooner or later, by becoming little donkeys." "Is that really true?" sobbed Pinocchio. "It is, unhappily. It is no use crying now. You should have thought of that before it was too late." "But it's not my fault. Believe me, little squirrel, it's all Lampwick's fault." "Who is Lampwick?" "One of my schoolmates. I wanted to go home. I wanted to be good. I wanted to study and never do any mischief. But Lampwick said, 'Why should you bother about studying? Why do you want to go to school? Instead, come with me to Playland. There we shall never have to study. We shall only play from morning till evening and always be happy.' Why did you listen to that false friend, to that bad companion?" Because, dear little squirrel, I am a heartless puppet with no sense. Oh, if I had just a little bit of heart, I'd never have abandoned that kind fairy who loved me as a mother, and who had done so much for me. And now I could be a real boy like the others instead of a puppet. Oh, if I met Lampwick, he'll get it. I'll fix him." He wanted to leave the room, but at the door he remembered his ears, and he was ashamed to show them. So then what do you think he did? He took a large cotton cap and pulled it over his head, right down to his nose. Then he went out and looked for Lampwick. He searched the streets, the squares, and theaters, everywhere, but he could not find him. He turned to everyone he met, but no one had seen him. At last he went to his house and knocked at the door. "Who's there?" asked Lampwick from inside. "Pinocchio," said the puppet. "Just a minute, and I'll let you in." After half an hour, the door was opened. Imagine Pinocchio's surprise when he went in and found that his friend Lampwick had a great cotton cap on his head, which came down over the end of his nose. Seeing that, Pinocchio felt somewhat better, and he said to himself, "Perhaps he has the same sickness I have. Can it be possible that he, too, has the donkey fever?" He pretended not to see anything, and he said, smiling, "How are you, my dear Lampwick?" "Very well as a mouse in a Parmesan cheese." "Do you really mean it?" "I have no reason to lie to you." "Excuse me, my friend, but why then do you wear a cap that covers your ears?" "The doctor ordered it because I have hurt my knee. And you, dear puppet, why do you wear a cotton cap down over your nose?" "The doctor prescribed it because I hurt my leg." "Oh, poor Pinocchio. Oh, poor Lampwick." They kept silent for a long while, and the two friends looked knowingly at each other. At last the puppet said, in a sweet voice full of persuasion, "Just to satisfy my curiosity, dear Lampwick, have you ever had any trouble with your ears?" "Never. And you?" "Never. Except that one of my ears was aching this morning." "Yes, so was mine." "Yours too? Which one aches?" "Both of them." "And yours?" "Both of them." "Do you think that we have the same sickness?" "I'm afraid I do." "Will you do me a favor, Lampwick?" "Yes, with the greatest pleasure." "Will you let me see your ears?" "Why not?" "But first I'd like to see yours, dear Pinocchio." "No, you be the first." "No, dear fellow, you first, and then I'll show mine." "Well," said the puppet, "let us agree, like good friends." "What to?" "We'll take off our caps at the same time. Agreed?" "Agreed." "Then, ready!" And Pinocchio began to count in a loud voice. 1, 2, 3. At 3 they took off their caps and threw them in the air. And then something happened that sounds unbelievable, yet it was true. When Pinocchio and Lampwick saw that the same misfortune had befallen them both, instead of being ashamed and despairing, they tried to wag their long ears and finished by laughing at each other. They laughed and laughed until they nearly exploded. But suddenly Lampwick stopped laughing. He staggered and grew pale as he spoke to his friend. "Help! Help, Pinocchio!" "What's the trouble?" "Alas, I can't stand up straight." "Neither can I," cried Pinocchio, tottering and weeping. While talking, they bent down on all fours and started running round the room on their hands and feet. As they ran, their hands became hooves. Their faces grew as long as muzzles, and their backs were covered in light gray hair with black spots. But the most dreadful and the most humiliating moment for those two miserable boys was when they felt their tails growing. Overcome by shame and sorrow, they began to cry and lament over their fate. Oh, if they had only kept quiet! Instead of sighs and lamentations, they brayed like donkeys. Yes, both together in chorus, they brayed loudly. Meanwhile, somebody knocked at the door, and a voice shouted, "Open the door! I'm the little man, the driver who brought you here. Open at once, or it will be worse for you." Chapter 33. As Pinocchio becomes a real donkey, he is sold to the manager of a show and learns how to dance and jump through a hoop. But he is lamed one evening and then is bought by a man who decides to make a drum of his skin. As they did not open the door, the little man kicked it open and addressed Pinocchio and Lampwick with his usual laugh. "Hurrah for you! You brayed very well. I recognize your voices at once, and now here I am." At these words, the two donkeys became silent. Their heads were hanging down, and their tails between their legs. At first, the little man stroked and patted them. Then, drawing forth a curry comb, he combed them well. When they were shiny, so that he could see their faces in them, his face in them, he bridled them and took them to market, hoping to sell them at a profit. Indeed, buyers were not lacking. Lampwick was sold to a farmer whose donkey had died the day before, and Pinocchio was bought by the manager of a company of clowns and rope walkers, who intended teaching him to jump and dance, together with other animals belonging to the company. Now, you can see, my little readers, what a fine business this little man carried on. He was a cruel little monster, seemingly all milk and honey, going round the world with his coach. By promises and flattery he collected all the children who did not like their books, and who did not want to go to school. When his coach was full, he carried the children off to playland, so that they might spend their time playing and amusing themselves. When these poor children, from endless play and lack of studying, became so many donkeys, he took them to market and sold them happily. In a few years, by this means, he earned a lot of money and became a millionaire. I do not know what happened to Lampwick, but I know that Pinocchio, from the very first moment, led a hard life full of drudgery. When he was led into the stable, his master put straw in his manger, but Pinocchio spat it out after he had tasted it. Then his master, grumbling, put some hay in the manger, but Pinocchio did not like that either. "Ah, you don't even like hay," shouted his master, full of anger. "Leave it to me, my fine donkey. If you are so fussy, I know how to cure you." And he beat his legs with his whips for a start. The pain made Pinocchio cry and bray, "Yah! I can't digest straw." "Then eat hay," replied his master, who understood donkey dialect perfectly. "Yah! Hay makes my stomach ache." "Do you want to tell me I have to feed a donkey like you on chicken breasts and capon jelly?" said the master, growing still more angry, whipping him again and again. After this second whipping, Pinocchio thought it would be wiser to keep silent, and he said no more. The stable door was shut, and Pinocchio remained alone. As it was so long since he had eaten anything, hunger made him yawn, and when he yawned, he opened his mouth as large as an oven. At last, as there was nothing but hay in his manger, he decided to eat it, and after chewing it a long time, he shut his eyes and swallowed it. "This hay isn't so bad," he said, "but how much better it would have been if I'd gone on with my studies. Instead of hay, I might now be eating the crusty end of a fresh loaf of bread, with a fine slice of sausage. No matter." In the morning, he looked again for a little hay, but he found none, for he had eaten it all during the night. Then he tried a mouthful of chopped straw, but as he chewed it, he thought what a difference there was between the taste of chopped straw and rice or macaroni. "No matter," he said again, as he went on chewing. "I hope my misfortune will serve as a lesson to disobedient children who don't like studying. No matter, no matter." "Why, no matter?" shouted his master, who came into the stable at that moment. "Do you think, my dear donkey, that I bought you just to feed you? I bought you to do some work and to help me make money. Get up now and do your best. Come into the circus, and I'll teach you to jump through a hoop, breaking the paper with your head, to dance, waltz, and polka, and to stand on your hind legs." So poor Pinocchio, by hook or by crook, had to learn all these fine tricks, and it took him 3 months, and he got many sharp cuts from the whip. At last the day arrived when his master announced a really wonderful performance. Gaily colored posters were placed at all the street corners. You may believe me that the theater was full an hour before the opening of the show. Not one more seat could have been bought, even for its weight in gold. The seats round the ring were packed with girls and boys, impatient to see the famous little donkey Pinocchio dancing. After the first part of the show, the ringmaster came forward. He was wearing a black coat with white tights and boots reaching above his knees. After a deep bow, he made the following ridiculous speech. Honored public ladies and gentlemen, the humble undersigned, staying temporarily in your cities, wishes to have the honor, no less than the pleasure, of presenting to this intelligent and distinguished audience a famous little donkey who has had the honor of dancing before the sovereigns of all the principal courts of Europe. I thank you for listening attentively to me, and beg that you assist us with your inspiring presence and find excuses for our shortcomings. This speech was received with much laughter and applause, but the applause redoubled and became tempestuous when the little donkey Pinocchio appeared in the middle of the ring. He was magnificently decked out. He had a new bridle of shiny leather, with brass buckles and studs, and white camellias behind his ears. His mane was divided into small curls, each one decorated with colored silk ribbons. A broad band of gold and silver surrounded his body, and his tail was braided with crimson and blue velvet ribbons. In fact, he was a lovely little donkey. Presenting him to the public, the manager added these words. Honorable audience, I am not here to tell you untrue stories about the great difficulties I had to conquer in order to capture and subjugate this mammal, as he was feeding, wild and free, in the mountains and plains of the torrid zone. Observe, I beseech you, the ferocious gleam in his eyes. After every tender means of taming him failed, I was forced to use the last resort, the whip. Yet all my kindness, which should have increased his love for me, only made him fiercer day by day. However, following the system of Gaul, I found in his cranium a bump, which the Faculty of Medicine in Paris declared to be the generator of hair and dance. Therefore I have taught him to dance, and also to jump through hoops and frames colored with paper. Admire him and judge him. But before I take my leave of you, permit me, ladies and gents, to invite you to the performance of tomorrow evening. Should bad weather threaten, then the show, instead of tomorrow evening, will be set back to tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the a.m. Here the ringmaster bowed again, and then, turning to Pinocchio, he said, Come, Pinocchio, before you start your performance, salute this distinguished audience. Ladies and gentlemen and children. Pinocchio obediently bent his knees and remained kneeling until the ringmaster cracked his whip and shouted, Walk! Then the little donkey got up and walked round the ring. After a while, the ringmaster shouted, Trot! Pinocchio obeyed the order and started to trot. Gallop! And Pinocchio broke into a gallop. Run! And Pinocchio ran as fast as he could. Suddenly, while he raced around the ringmaster raised his arm in the air and fired off a pistol. At that, the donkey, pretending to be wounded, fell down as if he were dead. As he rose up, amid applause and clapping of hands, he lifted his head and looked up at the people, and there he saw in one of the boxes a beautiful lady who wore a heavy gold chain around her neck, from which hung a medallion. On the medallion was the portrait of a puppet. That's my portrait. The lady is the fairy, said Pinocchio to himself, recognizing her immediately. He was so overcome with joy that he tried to cry, "Oh, my dear fairy! Oh, my dear fairy!" But instead of these words there came forth from his throat a bray, so long and loud that everyone present laughed, especially the children. Then the ringmaster, to teach him that it was not good manners to pray like that before the public, struck him on the nose with the handle of his whip. The poor little donkey put out his tongue and licked his nose at least 5 times to ease the pain he felt. But how great was his disappointment when, turning to the box again, he saw that it was empty. The fairy had disappeared. He thought he was going to die. His eyes were full of tears, and he began to cry bitterly. However, no one noticed it, least of all the ringmaster, who was cracking his whip, shouted, "Courage, Pinocchio! Now show the gracious audience how elegantly you can leap through the hoop." Pinocchio tried 2 or 3 times, but each time he came to the hoop, he thought it easier to run under than through it. At last he leaped through it, but his hind leg caught in the hoop, and he fell heavily to the ground on the other side. When he got up, he was lame, and could walk back to the stable only with great difficulty. "Bring out Pinocchio! We want the little donkey! Bring out the little donkey!" shouted the children, who were all very sorry about this accident. But the little donkey did not appear any more that evening. When the veterinary surgeon, that is, the animal doctor, saw him the next morning, he declared that he would stay lame for the rest of his life. Then the ringmaster said to the stable boy, "What can I do with a lame donkey? Why should I feed him if I can't work?" "Take him to the market and sell him." As soon as they came to the market, they found a buyer who asked the boy, "How much do you want for this lame donkey?" "5 crowns." "I'll give you 5 pence. You mustn't think I'm buying him for use. I'm buying him only for his skin. I see he has a very hard skin, and I want to make a drum for the village band." You can imagine how Pinocchio must have felt when he heard that he was to be a drum. As soon as the 5 pence was paid, the new owner led the little donkey to a rock by the shore, tied a stone to his neck and a long rope to one end. Then he gave him a sudden push, and Pinocchio fell into the water. Pinocchio, with that stone on his neck, went immediately to the bottom, and his owner, holding the rope tight, sat down on a rock to wait until the donkey was drowned, so that he might skin him. All right, that's the end of chapter 33. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you join me here again to continue with Pinocchio. Bye, guys.